What Silence Teaches. Part 1. The week Chuck stopped talking. It began on a Monday morning in April 1979. Chuck arrived at the dojo at 5 a.m. as he had every morning for 16 years. He unlocked the door, turned on the lights, changed into his gi, and walked out onto the empty floor. He ran through the first form, the form he had been practicing since Korea, the form that had become the foundation of everything else he had built. 11 minutes, the usual duration, the usual quality of attention. When he finished, he stood in the center of the floor and made a decision. For 1 week, he would not speak during classes unless absolutely necessary. Not as a vow of silence, he would speak if safety required it, if a student needed immediate correction to prevent injury. But for all other instruction, he would remain silent and see what happened when the teaching came from demonstration rather than explanation. The decision was not theoretical, it was practical. He had been teaching for 16 years and had developed over those years a specific relationship with verbal instruction, explaining techniques, correcting errors, answering questions, providing the continuous stream of information that students seem to require. But he had noticed recently that the explaining was sometimes preventing the learning, that students were listening to his words instead of watching his movements, that the gap between what he said and what he demonstrated was creating confusion rather than clarity. So for 1 week, he would eliminate the words and see what the silence taught. Mots into Part 2. The first day, the 5:30 morning class had 12 students. The regulars, the people who had been training long enough that the early hour was part of their routine rather than a burden. Chuck walked to the front of the room. Normally, he would begin with a brief welcome, an overview of what the session would cover, perhaps a comment on form or a reminder about upcoming events. This morning, he said nothing. He bowed. The students bowed back. He began the warm-ups. Without verbal instruction, the warm-ups had a different quality. Chuck demonstrated each exercise, jumping jacks, push-ups, sit-ups, stretches, and the students followed. The synchronization was imperfect at first. Some students began the next exercise before others had finished the previous one. Some moved faster than Chuck's demonstrated pace, some slower. But after the first 3 exercises, something shifted. The students began watching him more carefully, not just glancing at him and then executing their own version of the movement, but actually watching, tracking his pace, his breathing, his specific quality of execution. The room became quieter. The usual low-level chatter that accompanied warm-ups, the small comments, the jokes, the social noise faded. The students were paying attention in a different way. After warm-ups, Chuck demonstrated the first technique sequence: front stance, reverse punch, transition to back stance, knife hand block. He performed it 3 times at full speed, then once at half speed, breaking down the weight transfer, the hip rotation, the arm path. Then he gestured for the students to begin. The students practiced. Without verbal correction, they made errors. Stances too wide, punches without hip engagement, transitions that lost balance. Chuck walked through the rows and corrected them physically, adjusting a shoulder position here, repositioning feet there, demonstrating the correct form next to an incorrect one. We have many more stories to tell and countless doors to unlock. Empower us with your likes, take your place by subscribing, and be the first to share in every new secret by turning on notifications. The corrections took longer this way. Normally he could give a quick verbal cue, bring your back foot in 3 inches, and the student would adjust. Without words, he had to show them, demonstrate the error, demonstrate the correction, let them feel the difference. But the quality of the learning was different. The students were not just hearing the correction and implementing it mechanically. They were seeing it, feeling it, understanding it through direct experience rather than through verbal mediation. The class ended at 6:30. The students bowed. Several looked at Chuck, with expressions of curiosity or confusion, waiting for the usual closing remarks, the summary of what had been covered, the preview of the next session. Chuck bowed back, said nothing, turned and walked to the office. Behind him, he heard the students talking among themselves, trying to make sense of the silent class, wondering if Chuck was upset, or testing them, or conducting some kind of teaching experiment. He was conducting a teaching experiment, but not the kind they thought. Duration 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 duration. Why? Ray said. I want to see what happens when the teaching comes through demonstration rather than explanation, Chuck said. Whether students learn differently when they have to watch rather than listen. Ray thought about this. How long are you doing this? 1 week, Chuck said. Through Saturday. The students are going to be confused, Ray said. Yes, Chuck said, but confusion is part of learning. If they're never confused, they're not being challenged. Ray nodded slowly. You want me to explain to them what you're doing? No, Chuck said. Let them figure it out themselves. On my fist, Mund Part 4, the third day. By Wednesday, the students had adapted. The morning class ran through the intermediate form, a sequence they had been practicing for weeks. Normally, Chuck would walk them through it step by step, calling out the movements, correcting errors verbally as they occurred. Today, he stood at the front and executed the form once at full speed, then once at demonstration speed, then gestured for them to begin. The students ran the form. Without verbal prompting, they had to remember the sequence themselves. Several made errors, lost the sequence, forgot a transition, executed a technique incorrectly. Instead of stopping and asking for help, they watched Chuck. He was running the form alongside them, slightly ahead, so they could see what came next. When students made errors, Chuck did not stop them. He let them finish the form, then walked to them individually and demonstrated the section where the error had occurred. Slow, precise, clear. The students watched. They tried again. Some got it immediately, others needed 2 or 3 demonstrations before the correction took hold. What Chuck noticed was the quality of their attention. Without his voice providing continuous guidance, they were forced to rely on their own observation, to watch more carefully, to compare their execution to his demonstration, to use their eyes rather than their ears. And the watching was teaching them something that the listening had not taught. The difference between understanding a technique intellectually and understanding it physically. When he explained a technique verbally, students could nod and say they understood. But the understanding was often superficial. They understood the concept but not the execution. When he demonstrated without words, the students had to feel their way into the technique, and the feeling was more accurate than the conceptual understanding had been. By the end of the Wednesday class, the room had developed a different atmosphere, quieter, more focused. The students were not performing for his verbal approval. They were working, genuinely working, with the specific quality of attention that comes when there is no mediation between the practice and the practitioner. She was in her mid-30s, a biochemist at a pharmaceutical company, with the analytical mind that biochemistry required and the physical discipline that 4 years of serious practice produced. After the Thursday evening class, the 4th day of Chuck's silent teaching, she waited until the other students had left and approached him. "Can I ask you something?" she said. Chuck nodded. "Why aren't you talking?" she said. "Is this a teaching method or is something wrong?" Chuck looked at her. The question was direct, which was Linda's manner. He decided the directness deserved a direct answer. "Teaching method," he said. What's the method? Linda said. Silence, Chuck said. Removing verbal instruction to see what happens when students have to learn through observation instead of explanation. Linda thought about this. Is it working? What do you think? Chuck said. I think I'm watching you more carefully than I usually do, Linda said. And I think I'm making errors I wouldn't normally make because I'm not getting the verbal cues I usually rely on. But I also think I'm understanding the techniques differently, more physically, less conceptually. That's what I'm seeing too, Chuck said. Linda was quiet for a moment. How long are you doing this? Through Saturday, Chuck said. And then you'll go back to talking. Probably, Chuck said, but not in the same way. What do you mean? I mean, Chuck said, that the silence is teaching me something too, about the difference between necessary instruction and unnecessary explanation, about when words help and when they get in the way. Linda nodded slowly. Can I tell you what I've noticed? Yes. Without your voice, Linda said, the room is quieter, and in the quietness I can hear my own breathing, my own movement, the sound of my feet on the floor, things I don't usually notice because I'm listening to you. She paused. It's making me more aware of my own practice, less aware of what you think of my practice. Chuck looked at her. That's exactly what it should do, he said. Punpunment. Part 6. What the silence taught Chuck. On Saturday morning, the final day of the silent week, Chuck taught the advanced class. 15 students, brown and black belts, people who had been training for years, who knew the curriculum thoroughly, who had reached the stage where the practice was less about learning new techniques and more about refining existing ones. He taught the class the way he had taught every class that week, through demonstration, through physical correction, through the continuous silent transmission of the practice from his body to theirs. The class ran through advanced sparring drills, the kind that required precise timing, exact distancing, controlled power. Normally, Chuck would call out instructions: lighter contact, watch your guard, reset the distance. Today, he demonstrated the correct execution, then let the students work while he observed. The quality of the sparring was different. Without verbal correction, students had to self-monitor, to notice when their contact was too heavy, when their guard was dropping, when the distance was wrong. And because they were monitoring themselves rather than waiting for Chuck's correction, they were developing the internal awareness that the practice was supposed to develop. At the end of the class, Chuck stood at the front of the room. The students bowed. He bowed back. Then he spoke for the first time in 6 days of instruction. Thank you, he said, for this week, for adapting to the silence, for learning to watch instead of waiting to be told. The students looked at him with the surprise that comes when someone who has been silent suddenly speaks. What I learned this week, Chuck continued, is that words are useful for concepts but insufficient for practice. I can tell you how to execute a technique, but telling you is not the same as showing you. And showing you is not the same as you discovering it yourself through repetition and observation. He paused. Going forward, he said, I'll talk less, not because silence is superior to speech, because each has its place. Speech for concepts, silence for practice. And you need to learn to distinguish between the two. Or mind to know. Part 7. The conversation after. Ray Medina found Chuck in the office after the Saturday class. You talked, Ray said. Yes, Chuck said. End of the experiment. End of the extreme version, Chuck said. But I'm keeping what it taught me. Which is what? Ray said. Chuck thought about this, about the week of teaching without words, about what had changed in the students and what had changed in himself. The words I use in teaching, Chuck said, have become automatic over 16 years. I explain techniques the same way every time. The explanations are accurate, but they're repetitive, and the repetition has made me lazy. I say the words instead of showing the thing. I rely on verbal instruction when demonstration would be clearer. And the silence fixed that, Ray said. The silence made me aware of it, Chuck said, and awareness is the first step to changing it. Ray nodded. What did you notice about the students? They watched more carefully, Chuck said. They relied on their own observation instead of waiting for my verbal cues. They developed the self-monitoring that the practice is supposed to develop, and the quality of their learning was deeper because they were discovering the techniques through direct experience rather than through mediated explanation. Are you going to do this again? Ray said. Not the full week, Chuck said, but I'm going to integrate more silence into the regular teaching. Let the demonstration speak for itself. Save the words for the concepts that actually require verbal explanation. He paused. The silence taught me, Chuck said, that I've been talking too much, and that the talking has been preventing some of the learning I'm trying to facilitate. Epilogue, the next Monday. The following Monday, Chuck taught the 5:30 class. He began with the usual warm-ups, but instead of explaining each exercise, he demonstrated and let the students follow. Instead of calling out the counts, he let them find their own rhythm. Instead of correcting errors verbally, he walked to students and adjusted their form physically. He did talk when introducing a new concept, when explaining the principle underlying a technique, when answering a direct question. But the talking was minimal, necessary, precise. The students adapted quickly. They had learned over the previous week that the instruction could come through observation, that Chuck's demonstration was as informative as his explanation, that the silence in the room was not absence but presence. At the end of the class, one of the newer students, a white belt named Marcus, who had been training for 2 months, approached Chuck. "Is this the new way?" Marcus said. "Less talking, more showing." "Yes," Chuck said. "I like it," Marcus said. "I learn better by watching than by listening." Chuck nodded. Many students learned better by watching. The verbal instruction had been serving the minority who learned better by listening. By reducing the verbal and increasing the visual, he was serving the majority more effectively. But the larger lesson, the one he had discovered through the week of silence, was not about student learning styles. It was about the nature of transmission. The practice was transmitted body to body, not word to body. Verbal instruction could point toward the practice, could describe its principles, could explain its logic, but the practice itself, the actual doing of the thing, could only be transmitted through demonstration, observation, repetition. Words had their place, but their place was smaller than he had previously believed. The silence had taught him this, and having learnt it, he would not forget it. He would talk when necessary, demonstrate when sufficient, and trust that the students, given clear demonstration and adequate time, would discover what they needed to discover through their own observation and effort. That was the teaching. That was what the silence had revealed. The following week he taught the same way, and the week after that, and the quality of the learning in the room shifted, subtly at first, then unmistakably, toward the deeper integration that comes when students are forced to pay attention rather than passively receive information. Chuck had been teaching for 16 years. The week of silence had taught him more about teaching than any week in the previous 16. Not because silence was superior to speech, because the balance had been wrong, and correcting the balance required understanding what each mode of instruction was actually for. He understood now. The practice continued. We have many more stories to tell and countless doors to unlock. Empower us with your likes, take your place by subscribing, and be the first to share in every new secret by turning on notifications.